Welcome to the TEK2day podcast powered by CEO Rater. It's your host, John Mayetta. With me today, I have Joseph Harrison from TCU. Joseph is a professor in the management school, and he and I have been corresponding by email over the past year, talking about CEO personality and what that means for the stock market. Other folks have done work in this area around specific personality traits, around how personality affects company-specific risks, how it may drive M&A activity, and all sorts of different pursuits. I think Joseph and his team took a unique approach, and we're going to learn more about that today. So, Joseph, thank you for joining the TEK2day podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Maybe we could start off, if you could talk about how yourself and the team came together. What was sort of the catalyst for embarking on this research?
Yeah, good question. It's actually it goes way before I met anybody on the team. I think the catalyst for me and my interest in top executives and how they affect particularly market outcomes goes back to my undergraduate degree when I was a business student at the University of Richmond. I had concentrations in finance and management, and I saw kind of a disconnect a little bit between the two and between some of the more classic theories of finance, things like perfect competition and the concept of the rational man just seemed to be disconnected from reality to me and how things actually function in business and how the market actually reacts. It's not always rational. Obviously, we know investors don't have full information a lot of times, so this leads to some interesting kind of effects where executives can have some pretty large effects on what happens with their firm, both strategically and in terms of market value. And so this kind of led me through my career. I went back to school and got a PhD at Texas A&M, started concentrating on that area with Steve Bovee as my advisor, and just kind of the rest naturally came together a little bit. Gary Thurgood was a colleague and friend who was interested in personality, and so we started talking a little bit about, okay, in general, how might executives affect these things, and personality might be something that has a strong effect. And finally pulled in Mike Farr, who is a content and text analysis expert, to kind of improve our ability to measure some of these things. So CEO personality, executive personality, which, executives aren't going to let you go into their firms often and give them personality tests. They're busy people. So that's kind of how it all came together, and that's kind of the justification for our research, as well as seeing how these things kind of affect larger, higher order outcomes for firms.
And Joseph, I believe you guys use the Big Five personality model, and I was just curious, were there specific personality traits that you focused on within that model?
Yeah, we did. So the Big Five, they're extroversion, neuroticism, conscientiousness, openness, and agreeableness. And so looking at these five, I think three of them really stand out as observable, or the most observable. If you consider openness to experience, that's a little bit more internal, dispositional. What are you willing to accept or experience? And agreeableness is all kind of relational. So those seem a little bit more difficult to gauge from an external perspective. Things like extroversion, conscientiousness, and neuroticism, though, I think those are the three that we focused on. And so you think about, some of the executives out there, you can pinpoint some of these characteristics. Maybe you look at Elon Musk out of Tesla, or somebody like Michael Leary at Ryanair, and they're just very dynamic personalities, right? And you can see some of these personality traits come out of them with how they interact with the media, with market intermediaries, and certainly as they're kind of making announcements and leading strategy for their firms.
And could you talk about when we spoke in the past? You'd mentioned analyzing earnings call transcripts. I believe it was the Q&A section. Was there any other data sources that you looked at, whether it be YouTube videos for user conferences, or you mentioned Elon Musk? He's one that's big on social media, so Twitter API data, things like this. Maybe you could just talk about sort of the raw data sources that you analyze.
Yeah, sure. So what we did, what we ended up developing, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention one more person too, actually, in helping us develop this, Alexander Gajranovich, who's a computer scientist that we reached out to help us develop it. But so there's essentially two broad sources of data that we had, and one was these conference call transcripts. The other was video data of interviews with executives. And the way that we developed the tool was using machine learning algorithms, where we took scores from a set of CEOs that we had psychology students rate based on the videos, about 200 of them, and then used machine learning algorithms to train models to predict personality or recognize personality based on the transcripts of their speech. So certainly there's different data sources you can go out and use. We found the Q&A section in conference calls was nice because it's a lot of text, number one, and it's also kind of off the cuff. Usually you have certainly these executives are going to be prepping for calls, but during the Q&A section, questions are not always easily anticipated, and so you get a more natural sense of their language use. Whereas, I think there's a lot of executives who maybe do post on social media for themselves, even political individuals who do that, and we see that's kind of obvious. But on a broader scale, though, it's difficult to kind of justify, I think, using social media or even like annual report statements, where you're not quite sure who it is that's talking. So I think from a validity standpoint, that's what drove us to look specifically at the conference calls.
Yeah, that makes sense. And most, not most, but probably all. I can't think of a company where the CEO does not use prepared remarks for all the content prior to the Q&A. So it's to try to glean insight from prepared remarks. It's not easily done.
Oh yeah.
And then when you mention machine learning, is that sort of a natural language processing tool, an NLP tool? Do you know?
Yeah, so it was a supervised machine learning tool. So, and we used open language learning too. So there's kind of a difference for your listeners. There's a difference between open and closed language approaches. Where a closed language approach, you'd take basically a dictionary of words, where you'd say, okay, these words should relate to a given construct or variable. So this fits with something like temporal focus, for example. If you're looking at, okay, are they using a lot of present tense? Are they using future tense? Where are they looking temporally? That's a nice fit for something like a closed language approach. So a lot of the NLP tools that are out there use that closed language approach. Ours was an open language learning approach, which is a little bit more of a black box. You can do kind of correlational analyses after the fact and see what types of language is getting picked up, but really it allows for a broader range of things like syntax, tone, different aspects of your language that are going to be indicative of the personality traits that an individual has.
And then maybe you could talk about what you guys tested for. If I remember correctly, in one of the papers I was reading that you guys tested for company-specific risks. If I recall, you took a pretty broad swath as well. As I think your initial models, you mentioned a couple hundred companies, but you tested a good-sized portion of the S&P, if I recall.
Yeah, so we looked at the S&P 1500, and actually, so this is where again I can actually go back and pull this up and look at the exact dates. If I recall, I think it was 2000 to 2015. That's digging back a while. I've moved on to other projects since then. So, but yeah, and it's looking at it was around 3,000 CEOs of S&P 1500 firms across that time frame, and we did look at beta, so the kind of the systematic risk, volatility and stock price. as well as the relationship between that stock risk and actual shareholder returns. So those are the two kind of outcomes that we were looking at, focusing again on conscientiousness, extroversion, and neuroticism. Yeah, and so what we find is pretty interesting. I mean, thinking about that broad of a set of firms too, and if you're considering, S&P 1500, they make up what, like 80 or 90% of the market cap of U.S. firms. So pretty representative, we think, and some of these effects. You look at the effect of extroversion and neuroticism, both increasing risk. Conscientiousness having a tendency to reduce that volatility, and then on the risk return relationship, what we found, which was somewhat unexpected actually, was the high and low levels of each of these traits have opposite effects. So we had anticipated, you have a more extroverted person versus a more introverted CEO. There might be a difference, but we actually find completely opposite relationships where somebody who is low on extroversion has they're more effective, might be a way of putting it, at translating that risk into returns, whereas those high on extroversion were less effective in doing that. So increasing risk leads to reduced returns over the next fiscal year. So and same thing for neuroticism, and then conscientiousness goes the other direction, where more conscientious individuals tend to be more effective at translating risk into returns, and those who are low on conscientiousness decrease returns.
Well, that kind of makes sense. A more volatile personality, maybe more volatile on the execution side, and therefore delivers more inconsistent returns. And you said, so you looked 1 year out to the next fiscal year. That was sort of the measurement period.
Yeah, so we looked at risk going on a daily risk averaged over a year, and then looking at returns in the next fiscal year, or the beginning of the next fiscal year, I should say.
What returns did you look at in the next fiscal year? Was it exclusively stock returns, or did you also look at financial metrics such as net income, revenue?
Yeah, so we're looking in this paper. We're looking specifically at market returns. So it's total shareholder returns is a function of both the share price appreciation as well as dividends. And elsewhere, we've looked kind of at performance more generally, return on assets. Those are typically, it's a little bit harder to gauge financial, like the connection between more distal traits like the big five and financial performance specifically. There's a lot more, I think, that goes into that. But I think there's a case to be made where we're looking at, perceptual measure, right? Where how do you perceive the CEO based on their personality, and a perceptual measure of value creation. Or this is again kind of where I go back to my undergraduate experience, and just thinking about market reactions and stock price as so much in a function of market perceptions, right? There's going to be a financial performance aspect to that, but really it's the reactions of the market that drive that.
And if I recall, Joseph, you guys took a sort of a holistic view. I don't think, but correct me if I'm wrong, that you measured these characteristics by industry vertical. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we controlled for industries, but yeah, I was really looking kind of broad strokes across industry or sectors.
And so I'm just curious. So I think I saw the article where I became aware of your research. It was maybe fall of last year, September of last year, something like that, maybe a bit earlier. What type of interest have you received from whether it be the investment community or boards of directors or anything of that sort?
Yeah, I'd say about as much as I've expected up to this point. I think, if not a little bit more. I kind of getting into this research just found it really intriguing, and think it's kind of where we're headed in terms of management research, is finding connections that could be a little bit more of practical use to the investment community. So I've had obviously you've reached out. I've had a couple of other individuals from different practitioner journals, Harvard Business Review, reach out, as well as some independent companies who I can't name just for legal reasons, but who've been interested in kind of looking at, all right, well, tell me about my CEO, right? Where I really think there are some practical implications to this research where CEOs are so, I guess, exposed might not be the right word, but they're under a lot of scrutiny in the present environment where, there's a lot of interaction with the external market, not just in kind of those quarterly earnings calls, but on social media and other platforms, and constant news coverage of what's going on. Just the world has kind of opened up, and so investors are getting information from a lot of different sources, and this is just one piece of information, right, that I think is useful for companies to understand that their executives are being watched, right, and how the market responds to those executives based on their personality. That's going to have implications for governance, and how you're having your CEO kind of manage him or herself in interactions with different constituents.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's great work for others to build upon. Joseph, thanks for joining the podcast today. Appreciate it.
You bet.